to, just so that on our end, it's archived. So if you ever need a copy of it, on our end, it'll be archived and I'll be recording, and that way any of your clients that want to access it, they have access to it.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. All right, let's get started. All right, my name is Mike Robinson. I'm joined today by my colleague, Dana Fletcher. And today we're going to talk about effective interviewing. We're going to talk about how to prepare for virtual interviews. If there's someone that's watching right now from Maternity Cares Coalition, you can reach out to Dana or myself if you need help with your resume construction, or you need help with practicing interviews for an upcoming interview that's scheduled, or job search tips, etc. Dana and I are available to help individuals with those needs. And our contact information is on the screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll also include our contact information so that people will have access to that should they have a need to reach out to us. And we certainly want to thank Portia for inviting us today to present on this subject, and we want to thank Ms. Angie as well for the invite. Dana, anything you want to say in your introduction before we jump in?
Yes, again, I'd like to thank everyone for inviting us out. And, for those of you, you have our information at the end of the program. We'll post it again if you want to reach out and get a specialized one-on-one appointment with me where we can help revise your resumes or some of the other services which you'll hear about. Then please make sure, to feel free to get in touch.
Awesome. All right, so let's get started. Now, in terms of preparing for your virtual meetings, your interviews, you got to test the technology first. Make sure that you test the technology, because it's always important to be familiar with the technology as opposed to jumping in on the session. You're unfamiliar, you're going through the motions in a choppy manner because you're unfamiliar with how to navigate, whether it be WebEx, whether it be Zoom, whether it be Facebook Live, etc. Be familiar with the technology. Also practice the responses to anticipated questions. Dress the part, always look professional. Even though we're in a virtual world with a lot of our meetings, and especially with interviews that are mainly being done by virtual means these days, you still want to look professional. And when you look professional, you have a professional mindset typically. And so you want to dress the part. I hear stories of people dressing waist up for the camera. But, anytime I have professional meetings, I dress for the full occasion. So if I'm going to wear a suit, I'm going to wear the full suit so that I have an attitude of professionalism, of excellence, of great customer service, with that kind of mindset going into the meeting, as opposed to being half dressed where I may not take it as seriously. So by fully dressing for the part of the interview, it just puts you in a different mindset. And be yourself. Monitor your body language. Like, I'm sort of animated with my hands, but I try to control how animated I am so that my physical gestures aren't a distraction. I was in on a town hall meeting about a week and a half ago, and one of the key featured speakers kept sticking his tongue out every time he would talk, and even in between conversations. And it was such a distraction. It really threw a lot of us off on the call. So you want to watch little idiosyncrasies like that so that you don't distract from the information and the professional appearance that you're trying to convey. And after your interview, within a 24-hour period, always respond with a thank you email or a thank you note that you send out to the people that you met with to let them know that you were gracious and thankful and appreciative that they set up that meeting with you. Dana, any thoughts before you jump in on the next slide?
Yeah, I would just say that, kind of picking up on a theme that you mentioned, Dan, you're going to see this theme repeated throughout the presentation, which is when you're presenting yourself in a job interview, whether it's in person or virtual, you want to get rid of any distraction, anything that gets in the way of the message and the image that you're trying to portray. So if you seem overly practiced, if you're not familiar with the technology, if you're not familiar with some of the other things we're going to talk about later on about background and things like that, if you're using too many hand gestures, it's going to get in the way of what you're trying to present. So the main theme for today you're going to see is making sure you deliver your message in a way that nothing distracts from what you're trying to bring across. Which leads us to our second slide, which is Forbes, has some more information about things that we can do to have better virtual interviews. And the first thing they mention is you want to work from a quiet place, a quiet room. Because if you're doing an interview and all of a sudden somebody's yelling in the background, or somebody plays some loud music, or you have something which is distracting, it could be off-putting for the person who's interviewing you. But then also people may think, well, maybe this person didn't prepare well enough to get a place. So you want to make sure the area is as quiet as you can make it. If you're in a situation where maybe, listen, I've got younger kids, maybe you want to make arrangements to have someone come and watch the kids. If you're in an apartment building or an area where you know is noisy, try to speak to a friend or family member to see if you can get to a place which is more quiet, so that way you can have the kind of background that you want in terms of noise. Also, if you do have people around, just make sure that, we know when people are at home, sometimes people are a bit relaxed. Make sure that nobody uses any profanity or anything that could be picked up in the background as well, because you don't want that to get across the mic as well. You want to make sure your background is neutral, meaning that you don't want a lot of big, bright colors. You don't want a lot of overly dark colors. You want something nice and neutral, not too dark, not too light. Again, so it doesn't take away from what you're trying to present. You want to make sure that your lighting is good. One of the things you have to remember about virtual interviews that are different, or meetings that are different than in person, is the way that you appear on the camera is slightly different than what you look like in real person. So if I was sitting in front of you today, or as you can see Mr. Robinson sitting there, the way he appears in camera and the way the colors show if you're in person may not be the same. So you want to make sure you have good lighting, meaning you don't want the light too far behind you, because then it's going to shade your face. If it's too far in front of you, then again, you're going to have another problem. So sorry, if the light's too much light behind you, it's going to be opposite. It's going to, like, kind of the background be too bright. If it's too much over top or to a side, your face is going to be shaded. So you want to make sure that your lighting is appropriate so people can see you clearly and they can see your outfit. They can see what you have going on. When you're doing your interviews, you want to use a computer, a laptop or a desktop if possible. You don't want to use your phone, because sometimes your phone, depending upon where you are, you may have some reception issues. And sometimes the performance of the phone on some of these apps is not the same as it is when you're using your desktop or your laptop. So again, if you don't have a reliable laptop, see if you can look amongst the people in your network, find something that you can use, so that way you can again present yourself in the best possible light. When you're looking at the camera, you want to have your eyes up. You want it to be, the camera to be about eye level, and you want to look slightly to the left or to the right of the camera. If you're looking at the screen, it looks like you're looking down. which it may show that maybe you're not paying attention, maybe you're just interested. So make sure you have your eye level equal to the camera. Make sure your microphone is good so that way people can hear you clearly. Again, like Michael said earlier, make sure you're dressed for the part. If if you have notifications that go off on your devices, make sure your phones are muted. Make sure there's no notification that goes off. And the last thing is avoid multitasking. You don't want to be in a meeting and you've got the screen on something else and you're reading something completely different. So while you're participating in your interview and your meeting, make sure you're present mentally by not multitasking. You want to add anything, Mike?
No, that was good. Now, be prepared, always be prepared for your interviews, which involves research, doing your due diligence to make sure that you're familiar with the organization, the position you're applying to, and also to be familiar somewhat with the people that you're actually going to be interviewing with. Now, what does that preparation also include? It also includes you asking some important questions for yourself. You need to know, why are you interested in this role, and be prepared to explain that, because these are some common questions that may come across in the interview. What do you know about our company? What do you consider your biggest professional achievements? Tell me about a challenge at work that you dealt with, and what are you looking for in this new position? And the key to answering these common questions is to be straightforward and to the point. You don't want to go off on all these different directions on a tangent. You want to be very precise in your answers. You want to give just enough detail so that you're not running on, with long drawn out explanations and stories. You want to hit it and quit it, because one of the things you don't want to do is to waste time in that interview. So be direct, to the point, with enough detail to inform and respond to the questions appropriately. Dana, any thoughts?
No, I think you got that perfectly. So one of the kind of interview questions you can see, as mentioned by SHRM.com, is behavioral interviewing questions, right? So behavioral interviewing questions basically focus on the idea that the interviewer thinks that they can figure out from your past experiences how you will behave towards certain things in the future. So these questions would be based upon scenarios, things that happened in the past, maybe a past accomplishment you have, or something you did that didn't go quite the way you wanted to do. Too, it could be positive or it could be negative. And what they're going to learn from this are going to be what behaviors, how you respond to things, how you process certain situations, the skills and abilities you have to function in different kinds of environments. So the way we're going to answer these questions is you want to give something specific and concrete as to what you did. You don't want it to be general, because if they're asking you about a success you had in the past, you want to give them specific, concrete answers about what it is that you did. So that way they know specifically how you achieve what they're asking you about. So remember, the things that you did in the past, people will see that as how you will be able to behave in the future. You want to add anything to that, Mike?
No, that's good. Now, the behavioral based interview questions are typically, over the last, I guess, decade or so, have become the most common questions that are asked in an interview. Behavioral based interview questions are the most common. And the reason why it's such a popular way of setting up interviews and asking interview questions is because it gets to the core of whether a person has the past experience to use as a predictor based on their answers as to whether they're a good fit for the position that they're interviewing for. And one of the best ways to respond to behavioral-based interview questions is using the STAR method. The STAR interview method is a formula that was devised to respond very succinct and very precise to specific behavioral interview questions. And the way it works is this. I'll give you an example. If I'm asking a behavioral-based question like, tell me about a time when you led a team of employees on a difficult task and how it produced great results. Here's a way that a person might answer that behavioral-based question. Well, back in 2017, I'm stating this situation. I worked as a supervisor with XYZ organization, and I inherited a team of people in my department that were really disconnected. They weren't very cohesive. And so what I did was I started holding weekly meetings for them to get to know me and for me to get to know them. I'm talking about task and action now. And as a result of the weekly meetings, I got to understand each employee's strength. Thereby, it allowed me to plug employees in to certain projects and certain aspects of department functions that made our department really churn and become really productive, to the point where our department was the recipient of Department of the Year several years running. And so I talked about this, I stated the situation. I talked about the task. I talked about the action steps that I took, hosting weekly meetings, and the result of understanding my employees from these weekly meetings, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, that allowed me to plug them in to projects and aspects of the department functions accordingly. And as a result, we were a top performing department several years running. That's how you want to, in a very strategic, in a very structured way, answer a behavioral-based question without going off on all these tangents. So the STAR approach gives you a very structured and very streamlined way of responding to a behavioral-based question. And you could use this formula for any behavioral-based questions. And Google behavioral-based interview questions to see what questions, sample questions you get that you can practice with a buddy so that you can use this STAR method. Dana, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that that equally important with that method is practicing your story. So a lot of times we may have the idea in our head, we have the general steps, but practice telling that story in an efficient way. Because one of the things I know is when I do my consultations, and I'm sure Michael, you get the same thing, people will say, "Man, I like the way you did that. That was so smooth. That was so nice. It was flowing." And the response I always give people is, "It's because I do it all the time." So if you practice these stories and you practice how to get from the situation to the task, to the action to the result, then when you get to the interview, you'll
Dana, you blanked out on us. We'll wait for Dana to rejoin us. He might have had a lapse in the internet connection. So when we look at the whole interview process, there's going to come a time in the interview, a part where you're going to play a role, because an interview is a dialogue. It's not a monologue. It's not you allowing the interviewer to have absolute complete control over the interview. You, as the candidate for the position, you have a role in the interview. It's a dialogue. Always remind yourself of that. The interview is a dialogue. It's you, the applicant, having questions and responses, and the interviewer having their questions and responses. It's a mutual dialogue of information being exchanged. And you might want to ask when it comes to the point in the interview when they say, "Mr. Robinson, do you have any questions for us?" Well, you might want to ask as a candidate, what's a typical day in the life like for a person in this position that I'm applying for? What are some of the company goals in the current quarter? What does my potential role in this company, where do I sit? How do I work with other people in other departments? How does my role sink in with the hierarchy? So those are some questions. And maybe none of these sample questions I have here are any questions of interest to you, but if you have some important questions to ask when it comes to that point in the interview where they're asking, do you have any questions for us? That's your time to shine with any pertinent questions that come to mind. Dana, are you back with us? You may have had a drop in his connection. So our contact information is on the screen. Feel free to reach out to Dana or myself for any questions regarding practice interviews, because we can do those through virtual means with Zoom. If there's some need for, some resume revisions and that kind of thing, anything dealing with, workforce development, we're here to serve you, and our services are free. That's one of the benefits that we provide, and I think everybody can afford free. And so I want to thank Portia for allowing us this opportunity to share with you. Now, I'll open up now in case there's some questions that anyone has for Dana or myself.
I do. My question is, how much during the interview do you consider that is crossing boundaries when you ask questions to the person who is applying? How much information do you consider could be too personal or professional? How establish those boundaries?
Well, there are certain questions, and I'm glad you asked that, Angie, because there's certain topics in an interview you never want to bring up as a candidate. You don't want to talk about age. You don't want to talk about your marital status, whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you're a parent or not. You never want to talk about that. You never want to talk about politics. You don't want to talk about your
Religion,
your ethnicity, your religion. Those are taboo topics that you want to steer clear of. You never want to touch those topics. One, they're illegal. So if an interviewer asks you topics on those things that I just mentioned, you're not legally compelled to respond. Now, you don't want to bring up those topics, because if you bring it up as a candidate, you just open the door for the interviewer to explore further. Now, again, the interviewer cannot touch on those subjects because those subjects are illegal. I can't ask you questions about your ethnicity, your gender preference, or your gender, or your religion, or your marital status, etc. Those are all off limits. As a professional HR person, we are not allowed to ask questions on those topics. And so because we can't ask those questions, as an applicant, don't ever touch on those questions, even if it sounds, so innocuous and very innocent. Don't touch on it. Like, oh, I apologize that I was a little late today because I had to take my kid to daycare. Now that sounds innocuous and very innocent, but you just gave, that employer ammunition to privately disqualify you from an opportunity. Because in their head, they might think, oh, little kid, this person might have other, punctuality troubles getting here on time. So they may not be punctual like I want them to be, because they got to deal with this child that they have. And you'll never know that that was the reason why they disqualified you. So just don't touch on certain subjects that have no bearing on your ability to do a job. That was a great question, Angie. Thank you for asking that.
I'm sorry that I'm asking so much, but I started, do you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I started recently in that new position as a family engagement. So I have a lot of meetings, interviews, and sometimes I have questions. And for example, during my outreach moments, we are trying to include another community. And when I have an interview to hire a new person for our position,